Thanks everyone for joining today's office hours on JavaScript for Apex developers. I hope all of you are healthy and safe and happy. This session will be recorded like all other Apex office hours, and if you have any questions at any time, I ask that you please post these in the Q&A and preferably not in the chat. And any questions for Dan will save till the end, okay? 2 weeks ago, we had a very popular Apex Office Hours session with the Oracle Spatial team, and this was on scalable, spatially accurate contact tracing with Apex. The replay of this session is now available, and I have the URL and the QR code for the replay right here. And also, our friends on the Spatial team have made a patch available for Spatial, which include the necessary functionality that Dan Geringer from the Spatial team demonstrated, and the patch number is listed here as well, and you can get this from my Oracle support. And later in June, we will apply this patch to both apex.oracle.com and Live SQL, and the Spatial team has kindly offered to author some tutorials on Live SQL to demonstrate this new functionality. As a promotion for the next office hours, in 2 weeks, this was a suggestion by Anthony Rayner from the Oracle Apex product development team, and it was his suggestion to host an office hours on the beginner's guide to Apex. There's vast interest in low-code app dev on Oracle with Apex, and this is really accelerating, so this session is quite timely. For those who are curious about Apex or looking to get started, the office hours in 2 weeks will be where you want to be. And I'd like to introduce Dan McGann, if I may, please. I've known Dan since 2010, and he's easily one of the smartest people I know. Dan's in the database division, and he is a developer advocate for JavaScript, and he's also happens to be an expert on Apex and JavaScript, and it was Dan's idea for today's office hours. And my briefly stated, my hope for today's office hours is really twofold. And that is, if you're a database developer, or if you're coming from an Oracle Forms background, or if you're just getting started with Apex, you'll see that JavaScript is not intimidating, and selective use of JavaScript can really aid you in your app dev. But likewise, I also hope that people who are longtime JavaScript developers and maybe proficient in various JavaScript frameworks, that your eyes will be opened up to Apex here, and you'll appreciate that Apex is really a very extensible framework, and you can also flourish with your JavaScript skills where necessary. And
the title really says it all. This is going to be an introductory level talk about JavaScript, and it will be targeted at Apex developers. So hopefully everyone here is somewhat comfortable with Oracle Database and, of course, Application Express. My hope is that you will leave here today having learned a little bit about JavaScript, thinking, you know what, I can do that. And hopefully you'll feel inspired to continue your learning in this area. Here's the high-level agenda for today. I'll start by talking about the basics of JavaScript, and then show you how you can add JavaScript to your Apex applications. And then we'll talk a little bit about the DOM and jQuery, and we'll talk about some next steps, and of course, open it up at the end for your questions. Part 1, JavaScript basics. So these are the things I'm going to talk about. You'll notice that a few things here I will not cover today, just due to time constraints. But again, in the next steps at the end, I'll point out a few places you can go to learn about these missing topics, if you will. So first, we'll talk about why you want to learn JavaScript, and then get into variables and data types, objects and functions, and finally, developer tools. Everyone should know who this guy is. That's Joel Kalman. He is the Director of Development for Application Express, but also the co-creator of Apex. And he said in a blog post back in 2017 that if you're looking for a great Apex developer, you're really looking for a full stack developer. But what exactly does that mean, full stack developer? Well, in Apex, we're lucky because we have a simplified two-tier architecture, at least in terms of where your logic goes. So of course, on the server side, we're working with Oracle Database. It will benefit you to learn about Oracle Database and how it works, things like what starts and ends a transaction. course, you'll need to learn some data modeling, hopefully targeting third normal form. And then you'll need to learn SQL to get at and manipulate your data. And finally, PL SQL for those times where SQL alone is not enough. But what about the client side of things? How is that supposed to work? Well, if you decided to learn a new language today, you'd have plenty of options to choose from. You have old languages and new languages, languages with cute little animals for their logos. But only one of these languages is going to help you on the client side in your browser, and that's JavaScript. And that's really the answer to the question, why JavaScript? There's simply no other option. So it ends up looking a little bit like this. We have HTML and CSS. You can think of those almost like prereqs. If the basics of Oracle database and data modeling were necessary to get to SQL, this is sort of the similar thing on the client side. You need to know just the basics of HTML and CSS before you get into JavaScript. Keep in mind here, your goal as an Apex developer is not to become a JavaScript master. It often takes just a few lines of JavaScript code to accomplish something that's not available out of the box to meet requirements you may need to meet. So here's the 30,000-foot overview. We're going to take a language you know, PL SQL, and compare it to the language you're learning today, JavaScript. Obviously, PL SQL is designed to extend SQL. It's the procedural language extensions for SQL, whereas JavaScript was designed from day one to program the web. PL SQL borrowed heavily from Ada, so the block structure, the fact that you have a declaration section and an execution section, the fact that there's a difference between functions and procedures, all of that comes from Ada. JavaScript, on the other hand, borrowed heavily from Scheme, C++, and Java. So its syntax may look a little bit more modern, but it's kind of a mishmash of the three. PL SQL is procedural, block structured. JavaScript is flexible. It's based on functions. You can use it procedurally. You can use it functionally. You can use it event-driven. You can use it object-oriented. It's a really, really flexible language. Variables and data types. On the right here, I have some PL SQL code that everyone should be familiar with. Zoom stuff out of the way. So it's really two anonymous blocks, one nested within the other. We have an outer block and an inner block. And we know that the scope resolution works where I can declare a variable here in the outer block. It's actually a constant, max salary, setting it equal to 1,000. And then in the inner block, I declare another variable, L salary, which is a number. And in here in the execution section, I can access max salary. So inner blocks can access the outer block scope, but outer blocks here cannot access the inner block scope. We also know that declaration must be done in the declaration section. We can't do it anywhere else in PL SQL. So here's the first declaration section where we declare the constant, and then the second declaration section where I declare L salary. PL SQL is what's known as a strongly typed programming language, meaning that when you declare a variable or constant, you also associate it with a data type, in this case, number. And you know that that data type is not going to change throughout the execution of your application. Also, case sensitivity is not by default in PL SQL. So up here, I'm declaring max salary in uppercase, and down here referring to it in lowercase, and that works perfectly fine in PL SQL. What about JavaScript? Well, here we have a similar bit of code. The first thing you should know is that by default, JavaScript works, scoping is based on functions. And if you're not in a function, you're in what we call the global scope. I'll be talking a little bit about that here and there today. But here I'm not in a function on line 1. I'm using the var keyword to declare a variable. So this becomes a global variable available to all scopes. And it's set equal to the string hello. Down below that, I have something similar to the PL SQL you saw before, where we have a function called outer. And then I have a function within outer called inner. So we can create the same kind of scoping scenarios we can do with PL SQL. The declaration for variables in JavaScript can be done anywhere. And it's just a best practice that we do it at the top of our functions. And you're seeing two examples of that here. I'm declaring variables as the very first thing in each function. I'm using the var keyword here to declare variables. This creates function scoped variables unless I'm out in the global space. There are newer keywords like let and const you can use, but they're not well supported in IE 11. They're cool because they create truly block scoped variables and constants, but again, not available in IE 11 and earlier. So use them if you can, but if you can't, var works perfectly fine. What makes JavaScript unique is that it is what we call a weakly typed programming language. So note that here when I declare a variable max salary, I do not associate it with a data type. And the reason for that is JavaScript variables rather, don't have data types. It's the values that have data types. So here we see a number 1000, that is a number. Here I see a string, that is a string, and we're assigning a value to the variable. So in JavaScript, this is perfectly fine. I can assign max salary to salary, and then immediately thereafter, I can assign this string to salary, and this is not going to throw an exception. And this may worry you if you come from a background of strongly typed languages, but believe me, in real world scenarios with your code, it's not going to matter so much. This is not a problem. Also note that JavaScript is case sensitive. So here where I've declared max salary in uppercase, I must refer to it down here in uppercase as well. And that goes for everything throughout the language. Here you have the most common data types you'll be working with in PL SQL. Almost every real Apex application will be using these types. So we have the scalars, we have large objects, we have composites and null. In JavaScript, it looks a little like this. Notice we have two groups here, primitive types and objects. The primitive types were really sort of the original data types in JavaScript. We have undefined and null, so there is a difference between those two in JavaScript. We also have string, number, and Boolean. Now on the object side, we have object, right? And you can think of that as the parent of all the other objects, but then we have things you'll often be using like date, array, and function. Now function here is weird because it's in the data type category. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And if you're wondering what the difference is between these primitive types and the object types, the main difference is you can think of what happens when you invoke a function and pass some parameters into the function. We know that we can pass parameters by value or by reference. Your primitive types will be passed by value. Your object types will be passed by reference. That's one of the key differences. Note that JavaScript does not do decimal arithmetic. So 0.1 plus 0.2 equals 0.3000004. It's a rounding error. And that, of course, is not the case with PL SQL. So use PL SQL for doing your decimal arithmetic, not JavaScript. If you need to use JavaScript, then you can load a library into the client side and use various methods from the library to do decimal arithmetic. When you want to create new objects, you'll have two syntaxes to do so. The first is known as the literal syntax, and the second, the constructor function. The literal syntax is a little bit easier, so use it if you can. So here I have a string literal, and I'm assigning that to the variable myString. Here you see a number literal going to my number, and a Boolean literal going to my Boolean. And this is very much like what we do all the time in PL SQL. Down below that, you're seeing some other examples. So I can do an array literal. I don't have to declare the type up front. I can just open with a square bracket and start putting a comma delimited list of values inside of my array and then close it off with the square bracket as well. This is the array literal syntax. And you'll note that the values inside the array do not have to be of the same type. Beneath that, I have an object literal. I open this with the curly braces and close it as well. And then in between, I'm just putting combinations of name value pairs. The name and value are separated by a colon, and the pairs are separated by a comma. So it's very easy to create arrays and objects in JavaScript. The bottom is an example of a constructor function. For whatever reason, JavaScript doesn't have a literal syntax for dates, and so we must use a constructor function. And you'll note that this use of the word new here, the keyword new, that's the giveaway that the function that follows is a constructor function. Another giveaway is this capital D on date. It's not enforced, but the convention is in JavaScript, if a function was meant to be invoked with the new keyword in front of it, then it would start with a capital letter. Keep that in mind when you're naming your functions. You probably don't want to start the capital. All right, let's move on to objects and functions. Now I have objects in double quotes here because I'm not using the object-oriented side of PL SQL, just a simple record type, but close enough. So first I need to declare a type, and this will be a record type. It's a person record type. It's got two properties, first and last name, both of which are varchar 250s. Once I have the type, I can declare an instance of that type. So here we have L person. And then to access or assign values to the properties, I can use the dot notation syntax you see here, property name, the assignment operator, and then the value. And if I want to access those values subsequently, again, I just use the dot notation syntax you see here. And I'm just outputting to the output buffer the first and last name with a space in between. In this case, it'd be Jane Doe. In JavaScript, it's a little bit simpler, again, because we have this object literal syntax. I don't have to declare the type up front. I can just go with the instance of person, which is an object. It has a first name property and a last name property, both of which are starting off as empty strings. Just like PL SQL, I can use dot notation syntax to assign values, but the assignment operator is a little different. And just like in PL SQL, I can access the values using the same syntax, but the way I'm outputting the string here is a little bit different. I'm using console.log. When it comes to functions, I mentioned that PL SQL has this distinction between functions and procedures. Functions always return a value. Procedures never return a value. Whereas in JavaScript, we just have functions. So if you want to do something procedurally, just have a function that doesn't return a value. It's really quite simple. There are two ways to create functions in JavaScript. The first is using this function statement here. And you know it's a function statement when function is the very first keyword in the statement. So it's a function statement. I give my function a name, in this case, my function, and then parentheses for any parameters, which are optional, just comma-separated list of parameters. And then we open the body of the function with the curly brace and close it with the curly brace as well. Here's an example of a function expression. And you know it's a function expression because function is not the first keyword in the statement. Var is. So I'm declaring a variable called my function, and I'm assigning it a function. This is one of those things that makes JavaScript unique. In this case, they pretty much work exactly the same. There are some nuances and differences. However, at the beginner level, I think it's best to just not get into those differences. So how do we use functions? Well, here's an example in PL SQL where I'm declaring a function called add, and it takes in a parameter, two parameters, both of which are numbers. We say up front that we're going to return a number, and then in the execution section, I'm adding the two numbers together and returning that result. To use the function, I just put the name of the function and then put parentheses after it to invoke the function and pass along any actual parameters that I want to. So here we have the equivalent in JavaScript. Again, just a little bit simpler. Here's my function add. Note that the parameters A and B do not have data types associated with them. Also note that I do not have to say what data type this function is going to return. I simply do the work and return the value. When we go to use the function, it's very similar to what we saw in PL SQL. We just add parentheses to invoke the functions and pass along any parameters. So what you've seen a couple of times now is an example of the fact that functions in JavaScript are first class. And this is really just a fancy way to say that functions are just like any other data type in the language: string, number, Boolean, function. So you can assign a function to a variable, you can pass it as a parameter to another function, and you can even return functions from other functions, which can be quite powerful if ever needed. Here you see an example where I start by declaring a function called my function1. It takes in a function or a reference to a function, and it logs to the console the value 1 and then invokes the function that it was passed. Then I declare a function called my function2, and it simply logs the value 2 to the console. Now on line 10, I'm invoking my function1, passing the reference to my function2. And so this one will run first, and we'll see the 1 output to the console. When this is invoked, we see the 2. So this is one of the things that makes JavaScript unique and something that maybe takes a little time to wrap your head around, but it's actually quite cool to get used to it. When you start working with JavaScript inside of a web browser, you'll find that the browser is going to give you a number of functions and objects that you can start using immediately. So the window is a really important one. That's what we call the global object, or the global scope, if you will. And you can think of that coming from an Oracle background, something like the sys schema, and that most of the things in the sys schema are made public, or at least many things. Then we have the document object, and this is really the API to the underlying web page we'll talk about a little bit later. We have console, which you can think of as DBMS output put line if you use console.log. And then we have JSON for stringifying and parsing JSON data, and then set timeout and set interval for scheduling work you might want to do once in the future, or perhaps on a regular interval or basis. You can think of that a little bit like DBMS scheduler. Let's find out who's been paying attention. Which of the following will not throw an exception? A, B, or C? I'll give you 30 seconds. Just go ahead and work through those. If you feel like it, you could put your answer in the chat. If you don't feel like it, that's fine too. I'm seeing some C's. I'm seeing some A's. Oop, we got some B's. We got a nice spread going here. And I believe that's 30 seconds. So is it A, B, or C? Well, let's work through them. So here on A, I'm declaring a variable. All of them are the object literal syntax, or at least they intend to be. So the variable is called object, and I'm setting it equal to, we're opening the object, property, so far so good. Then I get to this part, colon equals. This is the assignment operator for PL SQL. That will not work. It will throw an exception. Let's move on to B. Here, what I have in between the property, the name, and the value is the JavaScript assignment operator, but this is still not the correct syntax for creating an object in JavaScript. So we move on to C, and this is the correct syntax. We separate the name of the property from the value using the colon, and then the name value pairs with commas. So it's C is the correct answer. Okay, let's talk about developer tools. So when you're working with PL SQL, you're likely using some kind of tool to help you get your work done. Might be SQL Developer, might be PL SQL Developer, might be Toad. Any number of tools are out there. But the odds are you're using something. It'd be very difficult to be effective in a language without good tools. The same is true when working with JavaScript, and all of our browsers now come packaged with different developer tools. Personally, I find the ones that come with the Chrome web browser to be the best, but you have to learn to use your browser's developer tools if you're going to start working with JavaScript. So I'll just show you a quick example here. And this web page, I'm looking at apex.oracle.com. One of the easiest ways to begin opening your developer tools is simply to right-click something in the screen and select Inspect. That will open the developer tools, and it will default to the Elements tab, where you'll see the underlying HTML, and you can hover over different elements, and you'll see that it highlights them above. You can do the reverse, click here, and then hover over the content, and it'll jump down below. But at any rate, what you're going to do is select something on the left here, lock it in, so to speak, and then on the right, you're going to see the properties associated with what you've selected or locked in. And the cool thing is that you can come in here and change things on the fly, like maybe change the color of the text to red, or set the display to none, so it goes away. Now, none of these changes are permanent, but they give you a way to preview things if you were to refresh or back to normal. But you could take your changes then and bring them back into the builder to make them permanent. So this is one tab you need to become familiar with. Another is the console. So if you come in here, you can think of it like a JavaScript playground of sorts. So we've been learning some of the basics of the language. This is a good place for you to practice. You could declare a variable, say test, and set it equal to maybe value. Now, I hit enter there, that executed the code. So what did it do? Well, this is like executing code in the global scope. And I mentioned before that if we're not in a function, we're in the global scope. So I also mentioned that window is the global object. So really what happened here is on the window object, we now have a new property called test. And as you can see, it has a value, which is the string value. You can also declare functions. And when you do this, let's say my func. Now note, I'm creating multiple lines here. To do that, I needed to hold shift, enter. And the reason is hitting shift or enter alone just executes the code. But I'm just going to do a quick console log, and we'll log out. Hello world. And what I've done, I've executed that code, but I've not executed the function. I've simply essentially declared the function in the global scope. And now what I can do is just say my func, add the parentheses, hit enter, and we see that output. So the console log is writing output to the console tab in your developer tools. The other one I think you should learn sooner rather than later is the networking tab. I won't talk about that today, but it can be very useful when debugging Ajax. And I'll point out a talk later that you can attend to learn more about that. Okay, so that's developer tools in a nutshell. Let's move on to adding JavaScript to your Apex applications. Again, I won't cover all the options. I'll just stick with dynamic actions and dynamic actions with JavaScript hooks. What are dynamic actions? They are a declarative means for you to add dynamic behavior to your application. So normally, just like everything else in Apex, you don't have to write code to do something useful. You can simply configure various attributes and different screens to say what you want to have happen and when, and then Apex will generate the appropriate JavaScript code and add it to the page for you. You can think of dynamic actions as two parts, sort of like parent and child. The parent is the dynamic action itself, and this is where you're going to define some kind of an event as well as a related component, like the click of a button or perhaps the change of an item's value. And then the actions will be the response to that event. Perhaps you want to hide or show something, enable or disable something. I have a way I like to think through dynamic actions, and this is how it works. So obviously there's an event which leads to an action. Sometimes one action alone is not going to be enough, so the framework provides the ability to add as many actions as are needed. And of course, this is your parent-child relationship, the dynamic action and the actions. Now there's something else that exists at the parent level. It's an optional client-side condition. And if you use it, it's going to resolve to true or false and provide two different action paths, if you will, true actions and false actions. And just like before, one action isn't enough. You can add as many as you like in either path. So that's the main event at the parent level, click of a button, change of an item's value. But it's important to point out there's another event that's really relevant for all of these actions, which is the loading of the web page. So it is possible to have any of these actions fire at that time as well, in addition to the event they are specifying at the parent level. Just keep that in mind. Let's look at an example. So imagine you had a requirement. This is a page from the sample database application that ships with Apex. Imagine you had a requirement that said, disable the alternate phone field until phone number is populated. So here's phone number, here's alternate phone number. And maybe people are using this one too soon. We want to make sure they can't do that until this one has a value. Easy enough? How should you think this through? First, identify your driver. What's the driver? So in this case, two candidates, phone number and alternate number. Well, it's phone number that's going to determine what happens elsewhere in the page. So that's going to be the driver. More specifically, it's the change event of phone number. Is there a condition? Yes, and it could go either way. We could say if phone number is null or phone number is not null, and that just swaps your true and false actions. And what would those true and false actions be? Well, in this case, depending on the value of phone number, I want to enable or disable the alternate number. Is page load relevant? It is, because when you think about it, when the page loads, even if we haven't changed the value of phone number, we need to enable or disable the alternate phone number field, right? So this is what it ends up looking like. When the phone number changes, the value is null, we disable alt phone. Otherwise, we enable it, and we take page load into account. Let me show you this live. So we'll go into the sample database application, which you can install in the app gallery. And we'll run this. Get logged in and go to our customers and take a look at John Dulles. So here we have the phone number and alternate phone number fields. Now, if I clear this out, come over here, I can still make changes, which is not what we want. So let's make it happen with a dynamic action. So you can come to the dynamic actions tab here, but I often like to start with the driver, which in this case is phone number 1. I'll right click that, go to create dynamic action. And I like to give it a name that reflects the event because the actions can have multiple actions and it's hard to come up with a good name for those. So we'll say phone number changed. Now, because I started with the driver, I right clicked and said create dynamic action. Some defaults were selected for me and they just happen to work in this case. It's the change event I'm concerned with, but I will point out there are a number of other events that you can work with in a web browser. We're just going with change for now. And it's the change event on an item, but it might be a button, a region, something else declarative, and it's this phone number item. Now, I do want to have a client-side condition. I'm going to say the value is null, and that's phone number 1. So once I've done that, I've created the fork between our true and false actions. Now, the default action in the true branch is show. I actually want to disable on null, so I'll select disable. And I want to disable an item, and it's going to be that phone number 2 field. Here's the other part I was talking about, this fire on initialization. This is the page load in this case. So this is something you can toggle on or off. It's actually correct as is. It defaulted well. So we'll leave that alone. And this is cool because disable has an equal opposite. Enable, just like hide or show. I can right click this guy and say create opposite action, and it'll put that in the false branch as the opposite automatically. So I think that's good. go ahead and save the change, and we'll come back to the app, and I will reload this frame. And so now if I go to clear out the phone number, tab out, I can no longer access and manipulate the values in alternate phone number. And if I leave these null and I hit apply changes, now we go back into John, who does not have a phone number value anymore. It's on page load also disabled, which is really important. So that is dynamic actions in a nutshell. Let's talk about JavaScript hooks. The creators of the dynamic action framework knew that you couldn't put a declarative interface on top of everything you can do with JavaScript. It's simply impossible. Even if you tried, it wouldn't look very good or be very usable. So instead, what they've done is provided a number of what I call JavaScript hooks that you can leverage, provided, of course, you know a little JavaScript. And I think this is going to be the sweet spot for most Apex developers. So here's the first of what you'll find. We're looking at the parent part, the dynamic action definition. And we're looking first at the event here. So I showed you that there are a number of events you can choose, but not every event will be in the list. And if that's the case, fine, no big deal, just select custom. That will expose this custom event field, and you can type in any event name you wish. Beneath that, there's a selection type. Typically, you're selecting items, buttons, regions, declarative things. But if you want to select something that's not declarative, you can use jQuery selector, provided you know how to write a jQuery selector. And we'll talk about those very shortly here. But you can just put that in the jQuery selector field. Staying at the parent level, but moving down to the client-side condition, you saw me use item is null. That's one of the declarative ones. The declarative ones only work with a single item's value. Oftentimes that's good enough, but if you need to work with multiple item values, or perhaps do a condition that has nothing to do with an item's value, well, you have JavaScript expression. You can select this option, provided you know a little JavaScript, you can put an expression in here. Moving down now to the child portion. Again, lots of different declarative actions, hide, show, enable, disable, refresh, which is nice, declarative Ajax. But you're not going to find everything you might want to do in the list. If that's the case, you can select execute JavaScript code, and then your action can be based on whatever code you can write. All right, moving on now to part 3, working with the DOM and jQuery. So I'll start off talking a little bit about what the DOM is, and then we'll get into what jQuery is, what makes it different, and finally I'll show you how you can select, traverse, and manipulate the DOM using jQuery. So hopefully everyone here knows the basics of HTML. That's just the markup language that your browser uses to render a web page. And in the early days of the web, it was really that simple. Web browser requests web page, static file is sent across the network, browser renders web page. Simple. But browser manufacturers knew that we needed the power to do more. We needed the ability to put logic in that document and then ship that over and execute that on the client side in the browser. In order to do that, we needed a standard. And the standard is known as the Document Object Model, or the DOM for short. You can think of this also as 2 parts. First, it's an in-memory representation of the web page. Because HTML is hierarchical in nature, so is the DOM, and that's why it's sometimes referred to as the DOM tree. And it's also an API for being able to manipulate that memory structure. And then, of course, the changes you make in memory are reflected immediately in the browser. And you saw that a moment ago when I showed you the developer tools. So here's the basic idea. We have an HTML document, and you can see that HTML, it's hierarchical, right? So this is the parent of everything. Body is the child of HTML. Body also has a paragraph, which has a little text. And then we have a div here with an image. And when the browser reads this, the first thing it does is parses it and creates this in-memory representation, the DOM tree. And the cool thing is that these nodes in the tree have methods that allow you to manipulate their properties and contents and thus change what you're seeing in the web page. Now, the DOM is actually not part of JavaScript, the language. So what we were talking about in the first part was JavaScript alone. But when you work with JavaScript in a web browser, I mentioned that you get things by default like JSON or set timeout and set interval. These are not part of the core language, but you get access to these inside of a web browser. So it's really when you learn to use JavaScript language and combine it with these different web APIs, as they're called, that you can pretty much do anything you need to in a web app. And the way that the DOM is exposed to us, again, window is the global object, and there's a property on it called document. Document is your access to the DOM. So what's jQuery then? Well, in the early days of the DOM, things were not so good. The APIs that were available in the DOM were super tedious to use. And to make matters worse, browsers implemented them inconsistently. So you would see code that said, if you're in Internet Explorer, execute this code path. For everything else, execute a different code path. And nobody wanted to write code like that. So people started experimenting with JavaScript libraries. And in 2006, we got jQuery. And it pretty much solved all the problems. It provided a very simple, easy to use API, and it worked consistently across all major browsers. It even today still patches little bugs here and there in different browsers. So a very useful little library. I will point out that the DOM APIs have been evolving over time. They're not like they were back in 2005. They're a lot better. Some people are moving off of jQuery completely. There's a website I have here. You might not need jQuery.com. You can go there, put in the name of a method in jQuery. It'll show you the equivalent using native DOM APIs. Frankly, I think jQuery is still better in a lot of ways, and it's not going anywhere anytime soon in Apex. So I still think there's a lot of value in learning jQuery, but you might also choose to learn native DOM APIs as well. If you go to use jQuery, it's a three-step process. The first is to include jQuery on your web page. In Apex, you don't have to do that. It's already been done for you. When you add jQuery to a web page, it adds this object called jQuery to the global scope or the window. So you can access it that way. It also adds a shortcut, the $. Most people use this because it's shorter. And then there's also apex.jQuery. And almost always, these three will point to the same thing, the instance of jQuery in the web page. Sometimes you'll get more than one instance, but it's very rare. So you include it in your web page. And then the next thing you're going to do is select something. Now, jQuery is just a function. So what you're going to do is invoke jQuery, and you're going to pass it a string, which is known as a selector or a query. It's very expressive, and then jQuery is going to use that to select the different DOM nodes that you want, and it's going to return to you a jQuery object, which will essentially wrap the elements you selected. You can think of it like an array. And then in step 3, you're going to do something with what you selected. So maybe you'll manipulate the contents, maybe you'll traverse from where you've started. You can work with events, effects, you have lots of options. So let's look at a few of those here, selecting, traversing, and manipulating. We'll start with the basic selectors you need to learn. And the first is selecting by ID. Elements in a web page can have an ID property, and it should function something like a primary key. There should be only one element with a given ID in a web page. So to select that element, you just put the hashtag in front of the ID value. In the example here, you're seeing jQuery, that's the $. You see that I'm invoking it. Remember, jQuery is a function. We invoke functions with parentheses, and I'm passing it the string. And the string starts with hashtag, so I'm selecting by ID. I'm selecting the element in the web page that has the ID equal to message. So this should give me exactly one or perhaps no elements. The next one is selecting by class. So an element in a web page can have more than one class, and you can have multiple elements with the same class. If you want to select by class name, you just use the period instead of the hashtag. Put the class name. In this case, I'm selecting all of the elements that have a class of boring. Down below that, I'm selecting by tag or element name. So you just don't use a hashtag or a period, and you will select by element name. In this case, I'm selecting all of the unordered lists in the web page. And finally, I'll point out that you can actually combine these with a comma-separated list of selectors. And here we're selecting elements with a class of fun, as well as the element with an ID of message. It's important to understand that there's a difference between what jQuery is going to give you back and what you get using native DOM APIs. So here on line 1, I'm using document, which is a native DOM API get, which has a native DOM API get element by ID. I pass in the ID, and it gives me back a native DOM element, which has its own methods and APIs. Down here, I'm using the jQuery equivalent. So this will do the same thing, but return to me a jQuery object which wraps this element here. And they are different. If I compare the two to see if they're equal, they are not. But what I wanted to point out is that jQuery, although it wraps the elements, if you do want to get to those underlying DOM APIs, you can get them out rather easily, either using an array-like syntax here. Just if you have more than one element, you got to pick the right index. But If you only have one, it would be 0 because it's a zero-based index language. So you can get that out and these would be the same, or you can use the get method. They work exactly the same. One of the cool things about jQuery methods is that they're most often chainable. And I'll show you some examples of that here as we go. So what I have here is an example web page that I built to kind of demonstrate some of this jQuery stuff. And this is a list of 6 basic emotions that Paul Ekman identified. He was a psychologist doing work in this area in the 60s. The interesting thing about this list is that happy is the only positive one, and then you have sad, fearful, disgusted, angry, and surprised, which aren't so great. I guess surprise depends on the surprise, but I don't know, it tells you something a little bit about humans in general. Now here's the web page, or the HTML I used to build that web page. You can see at the top, we have this H1 with an ID, and it says, how are you feeling? You can see here are the 6 basic emotions in a div, and then we have this unordered list with various list items, and they have their values and an associated class. So let's say we wanted to select something by ID. Here, if I want to select the question, how are you feeling? I can select it by its ID, just put hashtag question, and you would select that element. Or if you want the element with an ID of emotions list, you just change out the value of the ID. Here I'm selecting by class. In this case, there's only one positive emotion, so I get back 1 element. But if I select by negative, then I'll get 4. And then here I'm just selecting all the divs in the web page, or perhaps the inputs. You just pass in the element type. All right, so oftentimes in a web page, you can select exactly what it is that you want to work with, but sometimes that's not going to be the case. So what do? Well, you start with something you can select, and then because it's a hierarchy, you just traverse from there. You can go up, you can go down, you can go across, wherever you need to go. So here we have different functions for doing these types of operations. First, going up with parents, you have parent, which goes up 1 level, parents, which goes up all the way, and closest, which goes up all the way but stops where you tell it to and gives you the one thing. So in this case, I'm starting with a list item or list items that have a class of done and traversing up to their parents, which would normally be an unordered or ordered list. For children, going down, we can use children, which goes 1 level down, or find, which goes, it's like closest, but going the other way and finds what you want it to. So here, I have an unordered list I'm starting with, and I'm saying find the list items. Now, normally you could just use children, but if you had, I don't know, a nested unordered list, you could use find and keep going down. And siblings for going across. Siblings goes both before and after, whereas next and previous just target one side of an element. And you see the example here. I'm starting with a list item with a class of pending and then going to the next element. And then finally, filtering. So sometimes you select more than what you actually want to work with, and you need to filter that down. So there's different methods for that. The one I'm using here, EQ, let's say I selected 5 elements. This one will just give me the second element in that list because it's a zero-based index language. Okay, so here's some examples for traversal. I'm starting with the element that has an ID of question. I'm using the parent method to then go to its parent div, and then using find to go down as many levels as I want, finding list item elements. And if that was too much, I can use EQ, filter that down to the 3rd element in that list. All right, once you've found what it is you're after, whether via selection or traversal, you can then work with what you have. And there's lots of different types of things you can do in the DOM. You can add and remove CSS classes, modify attributes, add content, remove content, or change style properties directly. So in terms of adding and removing classes, these are the functions we have. In the example here, I'm removing a class done, so that's what I actually targeted, and then adding a class pending. In the next example, I'm using adder to manipulate the attributes of the element. So when you pass 2 parameters, this acts as a setter. So I'm setting disabled to disabled, which may look a little weird, but this is how Booleans work in HTML. If you just pass a single parameter, it acts as a getter, and it would return the current value of the attribute. For DOM insertion, we have a number of options. Here I'm selecting an unordered list using append to put a new list item at the bottom of the list. And if I use prepend, it would go to the top of the list. Here we have remove and empty. I'm using empty to clear out the contents of the unordered list. Remove would not only empty the contents, but also the element itself. And then if I want to target individual or groups of CSS properties, we have the CSS method, and I can change, for example, the color to red, as you saw before. All right, some manipulation examples. So here I'm starting with the element that has a class of neutral. I'm using add class and passing positive. So you can see now that the element has two different classes, neutral and positive. And then I'm removing the class neutral. I've effectively converted surprised into a positive emotion. Here I'm using a more advanced selector, and I'm not getting into advanced selectors today, but I will tell you how this one reads. So I'm selecting by tag name, inputs, and normally we would get both, but this is an attribute selector. You see the square brackets, that's an attribute selector. The attribute is type, and I'm saying where type equals text. So you can see there's only one of these two that has type equal to text. So that's how I selected the single input. And then I'm saying set the attribute disabled equal to disabled. And you'll see now that this has this property down here. And the way this would work in the browser, once this is done, the end user is not going to be able to work with that field anymore. It's going to be a disabled element. Here we start with question, and perhaps you don't like the text of the question. How are you feeling? And for whatever reason, you can't change it in the server side, no problem. You can use the text method and just pass a new text. How do you feel? Maybe change it around a little bit. And finally, here I'm starting with emotions list, and then I'm using append to add a new list item to the bottom of that list. All right, that's it for today. I hope you got a good taste of JavaScript, how to add it to your apps, and of course, how to work with jQuery. So for next steps, I'll point out a few things. If you're interested in some of the parts of the content that you could see we're missing today, we're actually going to be doing some, this is a new group in the Office Hours program called the Developer Playground. And on June 24th, I'll be doing a session as part of this group. And we're going to basically go over the same content, but it will be the full content. We'll have more time here. And in addition to the content, we'll have some labs and some quizzes. So that should help reinforce your learning there. That'll be good. Also upcoming, Qualogy is doing a Meet the Oracle Masters series. It's actually already begun, but I'll be doing 2 presentations there. One you might be interested in, well, maybe both, but this one maybe, especially if you're already maybe familiar with dynamic actions and you want to learn more about what I consider to be the hard parts, you might want to join that. And then, of course, I actually have some of this content already recorded. So if you don't want to wait 2 weeks and you don't care about the labs and stuff like that, then you can take this already. I have a link here to the recordings. Also, as part of Apex at Home, I did a session learning JavaScript concepts from real-world solutions. A lot of these things are covering the same content, but in different ways, and each one has its own unique content. So make sure to check that one out as well. If you want to learn about the JavaScript APIs you have available to you, the easiest link within Apex, rather, the easiest link is apex.oracle.com/JSAPI. But if you're using an older version of Apex, this will always take you to the current one. Older versions of Apex have specific APIs, so I included the links to those. If you're interested in learning JavaScript in general and you like video-based learning, there's a website called Pluralsight that has a lot of really great content on JavaScript that I've included here. I believe Pluralsight used to offer, I haven't checked recently, but they used to offer a free month when you sign up, so you might be able to take advantage of that. Here are some books if you prefer more traditional reading on JavaScript. Now, the first 2 of these are free. There are paid versions, but the HTML version is free, and then the second one is actually a GitHub book that you can read on GitHub. And the last 2 are your more traditional, go to Amazon type books. Here's some jQuery specific resources. There is a tutorial as well as a book. And then I have a link here to the API doc, which is always good to read. Here's some JavaScript content on YouTube. Fun Function is a guy who does a series and just tries to have fun teaching JavaScript. That can be interesting. And there's actually an entire course for beginners here from some folks, Free Code Camp, I believe, which might be a good thing to look at. Okay, let's turn it over to your questions. If you have any, I'm going to go.
We have a bunch, and I've curated them all for you.
Oh, you're awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, you think you're going to finish early. think again. Some of these are easy.
Okay.
Joseph asked how to get this presentation, and it's specifically all these links. You rattled off just a cornucopia of links. What's an easy way for someone to get this?
So the easiest way, immediately after this presentation, if you go here, twitter.com/dmcgann, I will put the link to the slides there right when we close. So check that out. That's probably the easiest. However, as Joel mentioned in the beginning, this session is recorded, and all of these office hour sessions, recordings are made available after the fact. Joel, what's the typical turnaround time?
It's your management that controls it, so I would say maybe a day or two, right?
Okay, so yeah, probably within a day or two, you can come back to the office hours website. You can go to the Apex office hours, specifically look at all sessions where you'll see this particular session. And once the video is uploaded, you'll see a link there to it that you can use to get it on YouTube.
Okay. I'm giving you the softballs here first. They're only
All
going to
right.
get more complex.
Oh, no.
The next one's from Tracy. Actually, I recognize her as an Oracle employee. This is just a suggestion. She said, would be great if you could hold a debugging session, especially for dynamic actions. I think
Yeah.
that's a great suggestion. Maybe
Yeah.
even team up with Anthony Rayner on our team. I think that's a
Sure.
good one.
Thank you.
Okay. P. Bidgeway says, I'm currently defining a guidelines document for my company who have just started using Apex. All Oracle developers with no JavaScript experience. What is your advice for using JavaScript? E.g., some people say all JavaScript should be in JavaScript files, not inline. Also, some say avoid JavaScript because it may break in upgrades and try to only use declarative dynamic actions.
Yeah. So, I'm not a huge fan of best practices in general. So my take on this is the following. Everyone is sort of in their own JavaScript journey, if you will, somewhere on a spectrum. And when you're starting, of course, the most logical place to start is with dynamic actions and just the declarative features of dynamic actions. And as long as that's doing what you need to do, then you don't need to go any further, right? And if it's not, then yeah, you're going to need to start using those JavaScript hooks. And only when you're really piling on the JavaScript, your requirements require it. So you have a lot of this code, or perhaps you want to share code that you've written once on multiple pages. That's generally when I recommend you get into using files. And only when you have like a lot of this code do you ever want to compress it so that, each of these gets more and more complex. But you should only take on that level of complexity when the team is comfortable doing so and when there's a value add, not just because someone said it was a best practice. So now you have to skip dynamic actions and go all the way to loading files and doing compression and all that kind of stuff, concatenation. Don't bother if it's not necessary.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Next one from Anonymous. Can TypeScript be used with Apex? If so, do you recommend TypeScript over JavaScript?
Personally, I'm not a TypeScript developer. As far as I know, there are some client-side tools available. I've never really worked with TypeScript, but you can, as far as I know, use these tools to work with TypeScript in a purely client-side manner. If you like what it has to offer, the strongly typed features, then sure, I suppose there's a value add for me. It's just a little bit more, it's adding more complexity. And so I was already comfortable with JavaScript and didn't feel I needed to learn anything else. And there are some trade-offs there. I can include another link in the follow-up on Twitter to a discussion on use of TypeScript, and you can maybe read through that and make a decision for yourself if it's right for you.
Okay, thanks, Dan. This question from Kevin Zhang. Oh, Kevin, great that you joined here again. Given Apex 20.2 and above drops the support for IE 11, does this mean we should use ES6, ES 2015 syntax? For example, let constant instead of var when writing JavaScript?
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think at that point, once Apex kind of raises the bar, you can go right along with it. And frankly, if you're working in an enterprise that simply doesn't use these older browsers, you can actually jump the gun and start working with modern JavaScript syntax accordingly. So there's a website that you can use, which is Can I Use? I believe just Google Can I Use. And you can type in the name of an API or a feature in JavaScript that you want to leverage, and it'll tell you about the browser support. And if the browsers you need are covered, or the ones you work with are covered, then you can go ahead and start using it today.
Okay, thanks, Dan. Next one, again from Oracle employee Tracy. She asked this early on. How is the return value from a function passed back to the calling routine? By reference or value?
Oh, I suppose it depends on what the return value is. So if it's an object or an array, it would be by reference. But if it's one of the primitives we talked about, then it would be by value.
Okay. Oh, Vlad just educated me that the Tracy I'm referring to is not an Oracle employee, Tracy. Forgive me, Tracy. Last one here. This is from Anonymous. What is the best way to handle exceptions in JavaScript code, especially in Apex?
Ooh, yeah, I suppose, again, it depends on the type of code you're writing. JavaScript does have a try, catch, and even a finally statement that you can use. So if what you're doing is synchronous, and this is not a topic I got into today at the introductory level, but JavaScript code can run synchronously or asynchronously, depending on what you're doing. And you can use try, catch effectively with your synchronous code. But if the operation is asynchronous, perhaps you're using AJAX to bring in some data from Oracle into the web page without refreshing the page, that's an asynchronous operation, and try catch is not going to work in that situation. But in those situations, you're always presented with other options. So in the case of AJAX, if you're using Apex server process, you can pass success and error callback functions, which will execute accordingly and bring you back into the synchronous world in the right code path. So you have different options. It really just depends on the code that you're writing.
Okay. Dan, I think that's it. This was an excellent session. Thanks for the intro.
Thanks for having me.
As Dan is advertising here, people should feel free to join the hands-on lab on June 24th. And I'll remind people in 2 weeks' time, Anthony Rayner is conducting our intro to Apex for people who are new or are curious. So tell a friend or someone who may be interested in low code on Oracle. Thanks again, Dan. I thought this was great.
Thanks, everybody.
And thanks, everyone, for attending. I wish everyone a great day.
See you soon. Take care.
Thanks. Bye.